make it better or worse than what came before, but we also have to be ourselves, and it's like, we shouldn't just default to, okay, well, that's how Pattabhi Jois did it, so that's how I'm going to do it, and that's right. That's kind of wimping out. Like, it's like, oh, the knee should only ever be over the ankle. It should never go in front of the ankle. Well, why? What, and then, because it's another place where people tend to grab onto some little idea, and it just all of a sudden becomes the rule, and a lot of, why people say don't put your knee past your ankle is, based on research that was done with people doing squats with weight, and how it talked about how the transfer of force, go figure, went from the hips into the knee, the further the knee went out. Of course.
Right.
But
that's interesting.
That doesn't mean you have to keep your... Otherwise, our body wouldn't be designed to put our knee over our ankle if it wasn't supposed to do that.
I guess we're just having this all the time, aren't we? That we grab onto a bit of information. We think, like that is the way things are. And as you say, like, I mean, I had that instruction, I think, in the early years, because you don't feel like you know enough as a teacher, maybe. You kind of say these things, right? Like, like, don't put your knee over, just because you feel that that's how, what you ought to say about it, or you should say something, And so I guess there's another conversation about being honest and, transparent about what one does and doesn't know as a teacher, right? Whilst also offering, I think a lot of it is the way that one offers the possibilities. Say, well, there's many possibilities here. Like, I think I went to Lashana Small, who says, and she had this idea of, she talks a lot about ableism, right? And, the celebration of ableism in the yoga class, right? It's that the postures demand an incredible amount of ability, which inherently they do. And she talks about the idea of the chocolate, like a cake. You can have this kind of cake, or you can have a cake that's like this, or you can have a vegan version of this cake. It's like, I think, I kind of like the metaphor. It's much better when she says it. But it's quite funny. But it's true that you've got these possibilities, and I think the stricture on the passing down of what, quote, tradition often gets in the way of a really much more sensible iteration of a system which was always in fluidity. I mean, it was the Research Institute in the first place. I mean, it was being formulated, from the time when the first Westerners went there, for individual bodies, right? And it was only latterly, I think, with numbers, that it became this kind of, rigid kind of monolith that couldn't be moved anymore, which is...
Yeah. I mean, especially, just to follow this thread for a moment, I remember John talking about how, when he first arrived in Mysore, they practiced later in the day, and the locals went in the morning, and they all had individual practices that were outside of the sequence of primary, second, and third, etc., because it was based on conditions or problems that they had. And, I always think about, like, okay, well, the Westerners showed up. They were young, fit, healthy. They didn't have problems. So what to do? Primary, finish primary, go to second, go. That's how you learn.
Yeah.
It's like, of course, your point being, my point being now, to reiterate your point, which is there's always a certain amount of adaptability that has to be in place. Of course, if you offer too many options, you're just going to confuse students. So I do believe it is the role of the teacher to say, based on everything that I know, based on what I'm seeing you do, this is how you should do it. Or, when I show up to teach a week of Mysore, I tell students, I'm like, look, if I ask you to do it differently, you shouldn't assume that that's because what you've been doing up until now is wrong. It's just that, one, I'm different and I see it a little differently, and I'm looking at it from a pattern point of view, blah, blah, blah. But also that whatever technique you've been using has served you. It's time for the next thing, the next part of the process, or, to evolve, to continue to evolve, not to be doing it. Nobody practices, year 5, January 1st, the way they practice, January 1st of year 1.
Would hope not, anyway. Well, actually, I think that's wrong. I think, unfortunately, mate, I think some people do, but me included, I think I did that for many years. I think Leslie Kavanaugh says something like, we've got to assume that basically you arrive at the yoga mat, there's more things going right for you than there are wrong for you, which I think, which I think is a wonderful thing, because sometimes you just kind of think everything, like just in peace, everything just feels wrong, and it's actually where there's still more things, if you're on the mat, doing practice, going right for you than there are wrong for you. So I love that. But I mean, just as a segue, outside of that, is there, I mean, Ronald Steiner talks about the hip joint particularly, and with his medical knowledge, he is a doctor after all, how some people's hip joints articulate in a certain way, in which case leg behind the head and even lotus postures will never be efficient or comfortable or relevant, sustainably relevant to these individuals. I mean, do you have anything to say about that? I mean, because we assume that the sequences are there, as you mentioned at the start. You do, like an able-bodied, young, fit person without any existing conditions should be able to follow X, Y, Z and go on to do the second and go, right? But
sure.
That isn't, and you plot this trajectory. Oh, like I've done primary, okay, so a couple of years I'll get second, but it doesn't go that way, because our bodies have, certain, as we well know, have certain kind of skeletal, muscular structures, and we're so individual. How much does that implicate?
It's definitely true. I mean, even scapula shape is, they basically, they determine there's they classify 3 types of scapula, which changes, how far out the acromion is and the direction or the angle that the fossa is pointed at, all of this stuff. And it's similar with the hip joint. I think where I run in, it's true. There are definitely people who, based on bones shape, I've met them. I say, wow, you've been working on this for 15 years, regularly doing, lotus preparation work and all of this kind of stuff, and it hasn't changed. It seems reasonable that that's based on, and you see them there, in particular with the hip and talking about external rotation, they tend to be people with the legs internally rotated. You can almost see their femurs are they're not internally rotated because of the musculature, although that is a possibility. Or it's the musculature in addition to, the socket is pointed more forward, or the angle on the femur. I mean, there's multiple angles coming together. There's the forward, there's the down of the socket, there's, the angle at the head of the femur. There's a lot of stuff going on there. I definitely met them, but just because there are those people doesn't mean that there are an equal number of those people to the ones who can do it. They, when you plot things out, you tend to get this sort of bell curve. You've got people on one end of the extreme who are, they're the opposite of that. Their hips are actually skeletally designed to be outward and external, etc. It's probably, I don't know, somewhere in the range of 2 to 10%. And so the people who are on the other end of the spectrum are also somewhere in that 2 to 10%, right? Because it's not like everybody's angle is exactly the same in that group either. And then you have the rest of us, maybe a little bit more inclined toward external or a little bit more inclined toward internal. But the largest grouping is, people who can do it. That's the largest grouping.
It's a diplomatic answer if ever I heard one. But
I think that's not just diplomatic. I think that's the truth. And the problem that comes in is when we say things like, there are people who cannot do it, which I agree with, is making them equal to those who can do it. The thing to do is identify those people and be okay with them not being able to do it, and then being okay not being able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, because obviously you don't want people to stop too early, encourage them that they can't do something. Like say, because you hear that many yoga teachers have unfortunately conveyed this to students that have then conveyed it to me. Well, your body won't do that. This is, and it's just like, it's a damning piece of information to hear. But on the other hand, to allow the individuals that are working really hard on things, and to allow that it's not their fault, that they, right, that they, there's certain structural implications in the way of the best intentions and hard work. It's also a kind of a positive, affirmation to put out there for people, and to say like pushing and pushing, and it's just
again, if you're identifying them, correctly. That back to the assessment piece. It's like,
of course,
okay, if it's month 6 of your practice and you can't do lotus, we don't know that that's bone shape unless you want to go get, x-rays, MRIs, that kind of stuff, so that we can fully determine what's possible in your body. Then it should be encouragement to continue and let's see what happens.
Okay. Well, you mentioned a good point that I know you've talked about before, and when we chatted on the podcast. How have you got any rules of thumb for? I'm not going to ask anything funny. Don't worry. For assessment, because you talk about assessment a lot and assessing individuals. And I remember we did this with John actually, and you were in the class. For teachers perhaps. So is there anything that you can say? You concentrate on that, or look at that, or get them. I remember we did this thing with John where we stood up and we got everyone to stand up.
The plumb line.
Do you do that with students in the Mysore class? And how much do you get involved in this kind of extra structural assessment? And and do you? Sorry.
I mean, I don't need the plumb line anymore to do it. I do, that's the other thing that happens, if I put my hands on somebody to adjust them, I'm also feeling structures. Is that hip higher or lower? And it doesn't mean that anything has to change in that moment either. It's just more information. It's just me taking it in, right? Because the more information you take in, back to assessment, then you have this huge swath of information that seems disparate when you grab one piece, but all of a sudden you start to get a picture. So, I mean, my advice to people for assessment is, I think the thing that gets in the way more than anything is the bias, is to not really be able to look at somebody objectively. And I mean, we all have a bias. I have bias as well. It's not like we can ever get rid of them. It's like, it's as it's arising, you get closer and closer to going, do I really know that that's true? That person's hip is higher and therefore their knee hurts. Their hip might be higher, that you can say. You still don't know that that's what's causing their knee to hurt. It may or it may not. Because sometimes when we get information from students, my back hurts, my knee hurt, whatever it is, then we start looking for a solution to that problem. And that's where we start to close in, and we might miss something by being more open. We tend to close off. The bias is, I need to solve this knee problem, quickly, probably. We feel some type of pressure there. And then, the most obvious bias is somebody says their knee hurts and you look at their knee without looking at how their knee relates to their foot, ankle, hip, much less their pelvis and spine above that. Hence, it's another, that's what I mean by bias. It's like you just get locked into these ways of looking at things rather than...
But it's also, it's reductionist as well, isn't it? Because modern medicine obviously looks at the effect and treats the effect and the cause as the same thing. It's like, well, you've got pain in your knee, so the problem is the knee. Well, it's like, well, yes, there may be a problem with the knee, but quite possibly it's the effect of another problem, somewhere up the line, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
I suppose to round this off, I'd like to ask you, finally, what you would change of the system if it was yours? Do you have any, often people for example, talk about pulling. There's no pulling in the system, that the muscles need it. Yes, have you heard that? There's a lot of pushing. There's not enough pulling for the muscles. Yeah. This is one claim that, against Ashtanga for those anti-Ashtanga people that are trying to drag us down. Or the lotus. The lotus happens in standing, right? It's really early on to put that lotus in standing. Someone contacted me recently about back bends, pointing out, in fact, that the Asana isn't there in the Yoga Mala. I don't think. I think as I understand it, it came originally after the intermediate for those early students, right? And now it's pretty early on that you don't do so many back bends, and then you're into. Anyway, what do you think?
Look, there's no system that's perfect. Start with that. If you're doing Ashtanga yoga for exercise, for balanced exercise, you could find a more balanced exercise to do. I don't do it for... There is exercise as a secondary or tertiary thing going on. That's not why I started practicing when I did. So there's just that, to put it that way. I guess I have a little problem, comparing it to balanced exercise as if that's what it is or it's supposed to be. I would say primary and second are more balanced, and then, or even the amount of pulling. I mean, it's just, I've heard this before as well, and it's like, yeah, it's true. There's more pushing than pulling. And what is going to happen as a result of that?
Yes, that's true. Well, I suppose, arguing the other side of the fence, and I've been on the other side of this, many, many times. One time quite vociferously with one person. But arguing on the other side, it's like, well, people are using it these days, not for Chitta Vritti Nirodha. We're using it for, increasingly so for the sake of yoga, from BKS, Iyengar, and those, around that time that are using Yogendra, probably principally, is starting to use yoga asana as therapy, as physical, therapy for comfort and ease in everyday life. So I suppose it comes back as well to intentions and alignment intentionalities as well, as to whether one is doing something that's non-bodily or can you synthesize the both and do the both together, right? So it gives you,
I mean, I think you said it, it's a tantric practice. It's all, anytime you get around on a mat and jump around or do whatever, you're doing Hatha yoga, which is tantric. And it's about manipulating the body to cultivate energy. Period. Full stop. Any health benefits, any therapeutic benefits that come from it are side benefits. That was never the intention. There's nothing about fixing piles in Hatha Yoga Pradipika. I mean, it's just, so there's that.
Well, we have the Shatkarmas for a little bit for that, right? If we look at Svatmarama and the interest in the Shatkarmas, we have a bit of, and also sure. I better point out that we can't say full stop there, because it's the link with tapasya and Hatha yoga is pretty strong. There's a lot of Hatha yogis would call it, if you read something like Daniela Bevilacqua work about Hatha yoga and tracing the origins, a lot of the ideas of, and James Madison as well, or that it's just simply for tapas sake, right? Like for kind of a burning off of impurities or karmas, right? But there is this tantric element that creeps in increasingly so in the kind of Middle Ages.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where we're at. In truth, that's where we're at with it today. We're much more using it for, if we look at the way that we're using it, it's much more on that side of the camp than using it, just for simply the sake of calling yourself a Hatha yogi because we walk around with the arm in the air all day, right? Which is, by work for some.
Yeah. I think all of that is important context for it. But I still come back to the practitioner. Why are you doing this? And is that what you're getting from the practice? If you're going into the practice to have a balanced body in terms of push, pull, and your lats be as large as your pectoralis or whatever, then you're choosing the wrong thing to do for that purpose. That's it to me. It's like, what is your purpose here? I think that's because it's not false that there's not as much pull as push, but I don't know why that matters to somebody other than their reason for choosing to do it versus choosing something else. So if they want to, they can do something else on top of it, I guess. I'm trying to come back to your original, if there's anything I would change kind of question.
Maybe even in a pragmatic sense, we just wrap it up here, in terms of seeing, we've seen about all of us as teachers have seen so many unnecessary injuries, generally because there's a preponderance of chaturangas for people without strong enough, body, shoulders, etc., to bear this, for example, and then the knee stuff, right? And the two obvious things, and the lower back, the tendency to bend from the lower back, isn't it? Yeah. So,
that's what's in the population as well. Those are the three most common places.
Right. Okay. So just says it's moving around. Those are the things that are weak anyway. Or could we do something to change this as we teach it?
They're
beginners
mobile
upwards.
Yeah, they're mobile areas, so they tend to be prone to problems. I mean, part of the low back issue is that we're upright, quite literally. So, interestingly, there's basically 3 places where I put in preparations for postures, particularly when there's an issue or a problem.
Yeah.
And that is lotus, leg behind head or foot behind head, and back bends.
Yeah.
Chaturanga is more of a technique. And, I think the biggest problem is people biting off more they can chew too quickly. You're 100% right, is the shoulders can't support it, but people are also not necessarily clued into what to turn on, how to strengthen, what to strengthen, and what the process for building up that strength is. They just fly through a lead primary series and destroy their shoulders. I don't know about you. I'm not totally surprised by this. Should we be? Is it the practice at that point, or is it the teaching, or is it the student biting off too much? Good questions to be asking.
But or the logistics of numbers, where perhaps in a perfect world we would be able to see everyone clearly. We wouldn't have these lead classes where there's 30 people in the room when you can't see or haven't got the time to amend. I mean, you wrote a very good article on shoulder positions in Chaturanga, where the shoulder will be depending on how strong the person was. I mean, but to have that possibility to appraise a number of people in the room whilst doing a lead class is nigh on impossible. So
yes,
there we are back to logistical issues, really, when we're talking about a lot about teaching.
And this is why, just bringing it all the way back around to the beginning, this is why the general rules of alignment that everybody says are meant for that specific issue. And appropriately so, I would say. Err on the side of caution is reasonable. Don't let the knee go past. Let it make sure it's staying in alignment. Do the straight line thing. It's generally safer for more people that I can't assess and give specific instruction to. That is an appropriate place for that.
Yeah. Well, we've done about an hour. I usually like to keep it about an hour. Thanks for your time and pragmatic and realistic wisdom as usual. We didn't manage to get you to answer any questions straight, but I'm now appreciating it's a hallmark of David's teaching, which is, on a serious note, I think it's great because what what underlies that is to say that that the individual it gives the individual autonomy to think and to make and encourage one to make one's own assessments about one's own body ultimately, because you're the one that's feeling it and in it. And secondly, the gathering of information, gathering as much information, different perspectives as you can, as you would, for if your car was broken down, right? Exactly. You want to take and have a number of diagnoses from that, right? So I'll let you go and walk the dog or whatever. I didn't know you had a dog. You got a dog. Cool. Okay, and so thank you, David. Thank you for your time and a wonderful chat. Thank you.